Good morning. I'm Frank Kaufman, head of the Professor's World Peace Academy, and I'd like to welcome you today to the Scholars interview series of the PWPA. Today we're fortunate to have a very good guest with us. I'll be inviting him onto the show in a moment, Dr. Charles Selengut. He's professor of sociology at County College of Morris. He is known internationally for his expertise in the sociological, psychological, and political dimensions of contemporary religion and religious fundamentalism. He is author of many books and monographs, including Sacred Fury, Understanding Religious Violence, Jewish-Muslim Encounters, History, Philosophy, and Culture. Professor Selengut was a member of the University of Chicago Project on Fundamentalism. Member of the National Endowment of the Humanities. He was a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at Harvard University and a 1997 finalist for the Carnegie Professor of the Year Award. Professor Selengut is on the International Advisory Board of the 12 Gates Foundation and has lectured throughout the world, including India, Korea, Europe, and Israel. I'm very grateful to invite the professor to be on with us, and he will join us in a moment. Professor, welcome. Do you hear me fine?
Yeah, I wait to make it louder.
It's very good. If you can hear me fine,
Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks very much for coming on. Prior to bringing you on to the recording here, I've introduced you so our hearers know with whom I'm speaking. One of the main, well, not the main, but one of the prominent parts of how I introduced you included mention of your quite successful book, Sacred Fury. Let me just read a little bit about that, where I found on one of the publisher's sites. It said, "From ISIS attacks to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, Sacred Fury explores the connections between faith and violence in world religions. Author Charles Selengut looks at religion both as a force for peace and for violence and asks the key questions, such as how religious is this violence and what drives the faithful to attack in the names of their beliefs." This book was published by Rowan and Littlefield. And I think that our topic for today, a recent publication of yours, a lengthy article and quite a dramatic piece, in a way continues this same theme on, even if some of the activity we'll be discussing isn't religious violence per se. People hold their views religiously, even if they are political views or ideological views. In a certain way, I think somehow the same passions of identity operate, whether they're political or religious identity that's driving violent activity. Would you say that that's a fair comparison?
I would. Very often, religious violence is simply religious. It's fueled by a particular religion's scriptures and history. But quite often, religion serves as a kind of legitimation, a justification for otherwise political goals or even economic goals.
Yes.
So that the task of the diplomats, the statesmen, and the scholars is to try to analyze each instance of violence. Is it truly religious? And if it is, then perhaps we could find religious ways of mitigating the violence. On the other hand, it may be religion is just used as a justification, and the difficulty is that we have to resolve the economic or political issues which underlie the violence.
Right. Well, I look forward to discussing your work at length on this issue of just how much religion participates in what's called religious violence, because I know you take a very subtle and nuanced view, and you don't just buy into the facile, this is not really religious. You're really willing to take the hard look at the degree to which religion, in fact, may have violent elements. And we'll get into that on another occasion. I'd like to dedicate some time just to that book itself, but the occasion of this conversation is a recent article you wrote entitled "The New Anti-Semitism." Is that the whole title?
Yeah, that is the title. Yes.
Okay, very good. And I read it in the Jewish Standard. Was it published elsewhere,
Not
or
yet.
is that?
Hopefully, it will be shortly.
And the standard is what would be called more a newspaper, a journal, a
It's
monthly.
a newspaper, a weekly published in New Jersey. It's the largest Jewish newspaper in New Jersey for the Jewish community, but it has a wide readership as well in New Jersey and in other areas as well.
Okay, great. The reason why I asked is because the article is so long and so complex. It's like a journal article. As I read it, it's very finely nuanced. You cover your commentary with evidence of very serious research, and I couldn't even tell the organ that I was reading. It felt like I was reading a scholarly journal. So it must be an interesting paper. This is the Jewish Standard out of New Jersey. What I want to do is kind of unpack step by step each some of the core elements of what you're writing about. And the other thing that happened to me as I read your piece is I felt and prepared for this interview, I felt quite strongly that this will very likely need to be a two-part interview. So we do not need to rush in any way. I think we'll go 30 or 40 minutes together, and it's almost for sure that we will have to meet again and continue this conversation for at least one more session.
Fine. That's
yeah,
fine.
Good. So let me just read an intro to what I believe is, and you tell me if I got it right, the larger framework that you present at the outset, and then begin to systematically investigate each of the elements and implications. So here's how it reads at open. The current wave of anti-Semitic knifing and murderous attacks against Jews and Jewish traditions all over the United States, most prominently in the New York area, but also in places like Texas and Pittsburgh, rightly have frightened and terrorized many Jews about their safety in the United States. Rarely a day goes by without a report of harassment or violence in Jewish neighborhoods. These horrific attacks, however, are but an outward sign of the radically changed position of Jews and Judaism in America. Now, I'm going to stop there because the first thing I'm going to ask you about reactions of two different sorts. One is reactions to your core proposition. These attacks are an outward sign of radically changed position of Jews and Judaism in America. Some may say yes, some may say no, some may say it's random or something. And so first thing I'd like to ask you is the reaction just to your claim that these are an outward sign of something that is radically changed. Is there reception to that? Do you get pushback to that? Both especially in the Jewish community is where I'm really interested to find that particular,
Yeah, there has been considerable pushback to this, my thesis, to this position. Both many American Jews and non-Jews as well, well-meaning, refuse to recognize the very novel and precarious position of American Jews. Jews want to believe that the early reception of Judaism and Jews in America continues. But if you look at the Democratic Party itself, that and the anti-Israeli animus that exists, there you see the real difference. That now, and I hate to say this, almost as if in Nazi Germany, being Jewish itself, or being, I shouldn't say Jewish, being pro-Israel is itself a crime. In other words, you're no longer permitted to be part of a progressive movement or in a liberal elite or even a demonstration if you're Jewish. Many progressive and leftist Jews feel terribly left out, even though they may be in accord with progressive leftist positions. So what is happening in America, to be Jewish itself is a kind of crime or to be under suspicious. Many Jews don't want to recognize this, but there's ample evidence that this goes on. One evidence would be on college campuses where pro-Israeli speakers or ambassadors or even a professor like Alan Dershowitz from Harvard University are shouted down. This is not to deny that all the writers on the Israeli side and all the wrong on the Palestinian, or nothing of the sort. This is both sides have legitimate issues with each other. My point is that the left has become non-pluralistic. It will see all the crimes being committed by the Israeli military, but a refusal to recognize the crimes of Hamas and of the Palestinian terrorism. My point is that what has occurred now on the left is a refusal to see any legitimacy to Jewish rights in the Holy Land. And this is now transferred to the American Jewish community, where Jews are now seen as a marginal and a residual category, where they're seen as being aligned with a colonialist and a terrorist state. This is new.
Yeah, this is haunting. And you recall when we were talking casually about your piece, I couldn't get it at all. You said, we got to the point where you said, Frank, just let me send you the article, because and upon reading it, this is something that I'd really like our listeners to catch. Being Jewish itself is a crime. This is something you've identified here. And the pushback will come from, I'm guessing, in the Jewish community that refuse to say that in America, this can never be the case. We can't have parallels to any of the horrific historical societies in which that was the case.
Yeah, you put it very well. You put it very well. Particularly for most Jews in America who are identified and very strongly committed to the liberal agenda, to leftist causes. And for good reason. Jews were prominent in the union movement for civil rights and a whole host of workers' rights. So
right. I'm going to get to that in a moment,
sure.
and give our readers some precise language on that. So I don't mean to cut you off because it's your own writing, but I just wanted to start out just on the thesis that in a certain way that there is a rise of classical anti-Semitism in America, and the reaction has been mixed there, and including some real pushback that will not entertain that. Is that so? Or
yes, I would say so, and I know it's an unpopular view, but just look at what happened with the even Congressman Ella Omar, who used classical anti-Semitic language. It's all about the Benjamins. And
yes.
There was really no direct response to this. There was a general response by the Democratic Party to censor any discriminatory language against any religion. But this specific response, and the specific response in many academic settings to Jews who want to join in progressive movements, there isolated. So there's many college students who say, I'm a leftist, I want to protest against the unfair treatment of workers. And they're denied any right to participate because they say, you cannot participate because you're Jewish.
You're a colonialist. You're a
The
racist.
very idea of being Jewish is a kind of stigma. And that, I think, is new in American society.
I see. Okay, this is incredible. Okay, very good. Now, what I had prepared or want to unfold here with us is, so the first is your main thesis, and it's more a statement of, well, it's autobiographical and it's a statement about America. No, that can never be the case here. And you're arguing in a quite well researched and sophisticated way. Please watch out. This may be unpopular. You may never have thought of this. You may be not connecting the dots, but you are seeing something that pretends to be extremely frightening. And then the article goes, that's correct, right?
I think so.
Right. Okay. And then the article goes on to list which we've already touched on now, what you identify as the signs of this. So you're defending it by saying, well, push back if you like, but look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. And you've done that already here on our call a bit. The second thing is the way you connect the dots, the way you analyze your observations. And finally, the way you conclude, are there paths to avert the genuinely horrific negatives? Is this lost? Is it like that? So those are the other areas where you're going to naturally encounter debate, reaction, support, opposition, and so forth. So moving beyond now the broad thesis that we are moving into something that is very frighteningly similar in this unique thing, that being Jewish by identity, by birth, by race, by religion, by the dictates and anticipation of our own faith, is criminal by nature, is emerging in American conversation. And then you begin to introduce the detail. And I could have let you just finish, but I had prepared a little part of the passage that I'm going to read again. Unprovoked, violent attacks are often carried out by racists and deranged individuals, but they are encouraged by the growth of now acceptable anti-Semitic and anti-Israel rhetoric from, and here's the list, leading political officials, including members of Congress and some leading leftist progressive intellectuals. So what you are saying, and what you've just said on the air here and in the article, is the wellspring of these dangerous and horrifying eventualities come from several different sources. One are, sorry, I'm talking too much. This should supposed to be you. I'm sorry. One are debilitating social and psychological pathologies, such as racism and mental derangement. That's one thing that's causing anti-Jewishness. Just pathology, racism, mental derangement. The other one is, that you list on that paragraph I just read, are something what people call dog whistles. They come from both political figures and from other people of influence in American life, such as journalists, academics, and so forth. So can you, let me see. Okay, so the thing that I think that you've done, which is the second thing that I think is going to kind of put you in the hot seat, or in the, like a choice between the frying pan and the fire on this, is that in your analysis you imply that the anti-Semitism comes from both classically conservative or right-wing, or what, like, people always thought of Hitler and fascism as a right-wing thing, although it wasn't, but anyway. But you're saying also it's coming from the left, and that's where I think you may be inviting real trouble to yourself from your readers and listeners?
Yeah. Again, this may be somewhat unpopular. I see the danger more from the left than from the right. The right are violent, and there are many cases of in the synagogue in Texas, in the suburbs of New York City, in California. I don't deny or minimize in the slightest right-wing violence from extreme groups. But my concern is that the left, because of its political power and its being a political elite and its access to the media, is really more dangerous. So the violence is on the right, but the reconstruction, the redefinition of anti-Jewish rhetoric and treatment is more dangerous from the left because of their elite power. So many liberals, and including Jewish liberals, refuse to recognize this, and would prefer just to zero in on really a kind of working class racism or anti-Semitic extremism of Christian identity or the remnants of the Ku Klux Klan. And again, I repeat, this is very serious, but the legitimation for a lot of this comes from the liberal elements who have now redefined Jews and Judaism as a unnecessary and residual and colonialist entity in America.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. So here's the interesting thing, that in your observation, you're seeing a greater and more somehow with greater power to manifest itself in the full dangers or horrors of anti-Semitism is more arising in the left. That yes, there's plain old what you call working class, kind of old-fashioned from days of I don't know, rural Christian bigotry or something like that. That's there, and that's can be activated. But you're saying that the kind of the web of the elite left that controls a lot of how Americans think, that's where a greater danger is being put in place, and that's what's new, or that's what's you're kind of raising the alarm on.
So a lot of the anti-Semitic attacks were carried out by disturbed, deranged individuals, for sure. Lots of people are deranged, but they don't do necessarily anti-Semitic acts or violence. What the liberal elite has done is, or the progressive elite, I would say, is provide a kind of justification, a background which legitimates or encourages these disturbed individuals to take on this violent activity. In other words, it's not just the derangement that results in violence. It's the derangement in the context and the umbrella of legitimacy that the progressive elites have provided.
Very, very good, very good, and finally, I'm going to go into that. It would be one thing if the victims of the rhetoric perpetrated by whom you've identified as the progressive elite, if the victims were simple, good old-fashioned targets of the leftist elite, the guy with the rifle in his gun rack in his truck, or the what do you call it, the Confederate flag draping off the back of your truck, or like you have your classic objects of scorn and derision from the leftist elite. That's one thing, that if their rhetoric is causing displacement or violence against that group, there's something that that happens. They don't like them anyway. But when you take a community that has classically spearheaded liberal thought and liberal political activism, that's what's so elusive about what you're putting
right
forward.
And the tragedy for the Jewish community is that that the bulk of the Jewish community, which you pointed out as well, so historically and even in contemporary times allied with the progressive and liberal worldview, refused to recognize this new emerging danger. And if you read a lot of Jewish commentators on the violence, they end up blaming President Trump and his rhetoric. So President Trump has done more for the state of Israel, and his own family members some of them are observant Jews. But this is all forgotten. There is a kind of psychological denial or refusal to recognize this new reality because it challenges the identity of most Jews who are identified with the progressive left. So there's a kind of almost sad refusal to recognize that that the people who we were once so associated with are now rejecting us. And there's a denial that things have gotten this bad. So the tragedy is both for American society and the danger it represents, because it begins with the Jews, but it never stops with the Jews. But it's also very sad for the Jewish community living in this terrible illusion that things are all the way it always was, and it's just these extreme racist radicals or the extreme Republican right that is the problem. And this is a kind of, the cognitive dissonance for the Jewish community is so great. And one of the ways of dealing with this dissonance is to deny the reality. And in my view, that is what is going on.
It's dangerous. Any denial of reality is always dangerous. Like a smoker of decades to suddenly have a wheezing cough. It's just not paying attention to something that needs attention. I'd like to read a paragraph about from within your piece, and also this article will be linked in the podcast publication, so the readers can go take it in, which I highly recommend. So another part of this, you write, and here's what we were just talking about. Many American Jews, the majority of whom were and are staunch supporters of liberal and progressive democratic political movements, understandably refuse to recognize the radically different and in my view now precarious situation of American Jewry. Liberalism is progressive politics, and its support for unions, minority rights, and the working class was the natural home for the masses of Jewish immigrants, and this stance continued for generations. So it isn't only just religious identity or faith identity or rootedness in the kind of texture of love that religion is. I got it from my mom and dad. I was on my dad's knee in the synagogue. Like, being a Jew, just like being any religion, is the fullness of our happiness. But also historically, the Jews, by the natural extension of how the religion guides our thinking, makes us perfectly at home in progressive political environments.
Correct.
Is that accurate?
And that's what makes it so tragic for the Jewish community, that their natural home, both historically, religiously, and socially, they were the staunchest defenders for civil rights. They were active in the desegregation and union rights and workers' rights, climate change. So the very groups that were their natural home are now rejecting them. It's very painful for American Jews to face this. And so what happens in many psychological situations in this way, you find a scapegoat. The scapegoat could be the Republican Party. It could be President Trump. It could be the right-wingers. It could be Christian fundamentalists. These are all ways of the fury that the Jews feel and the disappointment it's being taken out on to other groups that are not really responsible for their pain.
We're getting near a good a good close point for this, but I'm going to ask something that I think is a little bit, maybe sensitive. I don't know, but say I'm a classical progressive, left, politically left, maybe even socialist type of political figure in the United States, a Jewish person, and one of my fellow travelers are the likes of Congresswoman Tlaib or Congresswoman Ilhan Omar or something like that, who are overtly and actively and policy-wise intensely hostile to my homeland and to I don't know, they make a distinction, Zionists and Jews, but how do I as a progressive Jew live? What do I do mentally or socially or politically in order to stick to my guns as a progressive when what you described is now plain as day?
Well,
How is
a
that being done,
classical example
accomplished?
of this would be Bernie Sanders. Essentially, Bernie Sanders
Mm-hmm.
has now identified with the aggressor. He now blames Israel for all the issues, but you haven't heard him say anything about the terrorism of Hamas and the regular violence that Hamas brings on its own citizens in the Gaza, which is a totalitarian society. You never hear him say anything about
Mm-hmm.
that. All he does is he repeats the negative actions of Israel, of which there are many. So what happens is, for many progressive Jews, is they've begun to identify with their own oppressors. That is one response, and some others simply have dropped out of progressive movements and have really turned to a neoconservative worldview. This has happened as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this is happening,
Mm-hmm.
but it's sort of under the radar. It's not really
Mm-hmm.
articulated. But I think people like Bernie Sanders are an example of what is going on.
Mm-hmm. And to be a, how can you put it, above the lowest way of regarding people, there's a possibility that it isn't only just opportunistic, or that some Jews have actually purchased a genuine belief in Israel, in the Israel as an oppressive. They're anti-Israel
Absolutely,
Jews.
absolutely.
Is
And
that?
this is, I must say, hearkening back to what you said before, I I really understand and appreciate their dilemma. This is a way out of this terrible dissonance that they face. And one thing we psychologists have always pointed out: dissonance is a terrible situation to live with. By denying their own Jewish interests, by aligning themselves with anti-Israel rhetoric, with even anti-Jewish stereotypes, this really eases their pain, and they are much more comfortable living in that society. And you see a lot of this going on in the Jewish community. Again, this is not much spoken about, but in my view, gradually this will emerge. And there will be a schism even within the Jewish community. This is happening already.
And is there a kind of a generalized, how does this affect my Jewishness at home, my religion, my religious Jewishness, my life of faith and
Yeah.
prayer, and the how does that, and I guess an attendant question is, are those who have adopted an anti-Zionist or kind of anti-Israel political stance, are they, would that, is there any relationship between how you
Yes.
are
Yeah.
religiously, or
Essentially,
how?
there are three responses that Jews have had to this current situation. One is a return to religion. So people who might not have been observant or faith was not that central to their life return to synagogues, take up Jewish studies, and send their children to Jewish schools. That's one response. Another response, the other extreme, was that thousands of Jews are now leaving Judaism and actually converting to Christianity or to Buddhism. They're now Jews by birth, but non-Jews by choice, and actually aligning themselves, converting. Jews for Jesus would be an example of this. The Jews are very prominent in Buddhist movements in America. Some of the leading people in politics now have converted. The leading lawyer for one of the leading lawyers in the impeachment trial was born Jewish, as a leader of evangelical Christianity. So that's one. That's the other response, and the third possibility is actually joining in the progressive worldview and seeing Israel as a racist colonial state, which should be eliminated. So these are the three possible responses, and we see examples of this all the time.
So there's still a way to be strongly practicing or observant Jew and still be a part of the liberal mind frame that finds Israel as a big villain and a big oppressor.
Not. In other words, there's a real split. All data shows that the Jews who are active religiously have moved away from progressive movements. You still see remnants of that, but gradually this is dying out. In other words, you see this increasingly where non-Orthodox Jews voted for the Democratic Party. Religious Jews, people who went to synagogue regularly, voted Republican.
I see.
And gradually, some of those Jews will convert to Christianity and or drop their Jewish identity. And again, Bernie Sanders would be a kind of example of that type. This is the most outward, right? He's very much allied with Congressman Elon and with AOC. This would give you an example of this new change.
Yeah, it's extremely fascinating, extremely rich and complex. One of the genuinely most intricate and complex realities that you've just described. And if it didn't have elements of extremely serious historical horror lurking at the door, one is tempted to just be intellectually fascinated by it, but it's not legitimate just to have that distance from the phenomenon you're describing. There's too much at stake, but it's truly fascinating what you're describing. Yeah. So, Professor, I really am grateful for your time and your steady work that doesn't shy away from the difficult areas of study, and is always seeking a kind of the genuine, like that which is deeply relevant at a life and death level of, and that's how scholars should really take up their work. That's what we count on you for. So thank you for being with us today, and I really look forward to a next opportunity to talk further
Thank you
with
very
you
much,
on
and have a
another
good day.
occasion. Thank you.